Okay. Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to a new session of Wittgenstein's Philosophy in Times of Crisis. It's the 8th session of our ongoing workshop series. My name is David Palmer. I'm the host of today's session. The workshop series is organized by a young team of international researchers. One of them is my co-host today, Wei Zhang, and others can't be here today. Haichang, Danka, and Saori. We're coming from Germany, Japan, and China, and had the idea to organize something like this when the pandemic and the lockdown started, to compensate on the one hand for the loss of conferences in our scientific community, and on the other hand, to use our background and knowledge about Wittgenstein's philosophy to engage with the pandemic and with the topic of crisis in general. Today's session will consist, as always, out of a main talk today by Moira de Iaco, followed by a brief comment by Lucia Morra, and then we'll open up for discussion. I kindly ask you to keep yourself muted throughout the whole event, but you can leave your camera on if you want to, so we can have a little bit of having the feeling to be in the same room. If you want to ask a question later, please write so in the chat, and write already your question also in the chat. So if there's any problem with your connection, we can read the question out loud for you. Yes, please join me in welcoming our main speakers today. Moira de Iaco is a lecturer at the University of Bari in southern Italy and a research fellow at the Istituto Italiano for the Studies of Philosophy in Naples. She worked a lot on Wittgenstein. She wrote her PhD about Wittgenstein and solipsism. And sadly, all her publications or all her books are only published in Italian so far, but there are some English papers. For example, last year she published a rediscovered letter from Wittgenstein to Sraffa in the Nordic Wittgenstein Review that was also already part of this workshop series. And this is one of her main research interests at the moment, Wittgenstein's relation to the Italian economist Sraffa, who was also in Cambridge at the same time as Wittgenstein, but also Wittgenstein's relation to Marx and continental philosophy of language and art in general. The interest in Wittgenstein and Sraffa is something that she shares with our commentator today, Lucia Morra. She's also doing research at the moment on Wittgenstein and Sraffa, and had worked a lot on the concepts of translation and metaphor, and is also publishing on these topics. However, currently she's a lecturer at the University of Turin in northern Italy, where she trains medical personnel in philosophical skills in order to enable them to work with psychiatric patients and people with disabilities. So today we have two scientists here who are not only engaged with philosophical academic discourse, but how to reach beyond this bubble. Yes, I thank you both for being here and having accepted our invitation, although it's holiday season and everything is not so easy to organize. And yes, Moira, you have the stage, so to speak. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, David. I would like to thank you very much, the organizers of this online conference, for this opportunity to discuss the time of crisis we are living from the Wittgenstein's philosophy perspective. So I think it was a great idea. Thank you very much. The title of my talk is New Meanings for Old Words, Wittgenstein on Social Praxis and Language. In this time of crisis due to the coronavirus pandemic, one of the questions which interested me from a Wittgensteinian perspective, was in depth about the language used to talk about the pandemic and the changes it provoked in our life. By Wittgenstein's critical approach towards language, I intend to put today myself and you questions such as, how did you used to talk about coronavirus pandemic? Which kind of language games we did play to tell what happened? Did these language uses influence positively or negatively our ways of life? Did they give rise to misunderstandings? Firstly, I will focus on Wittgenstein's anthropological way of thinking language. It will so argue the inevitable connection between language and real life. Starting from this point, it is possible to understand the important relationship between language and the events of which we look at the events by the old words we have. Secondly, I will highlight the role of the concept of praxis in Wittgenstein's philosophy and the importance of considering ideas and concepts starting from their collocation in the practical context to better understand them and to reveal any misunderstandings they produce. This is, in my opinion, another relevant methodological instruction to the extent that by recovering the concrete context of the praxis of the language games, okay, I try to restart from the point I was saying. Secondly, I will highlight the role of the concept of praxis in Wittgenstein's philosophy and the importance of considering ideas and concepts starting from their collocation in the practical context to better understand them and to reveal any misunderstandings they produce. This is, in my opinion, another relevant methodological instruction to the extent that by recovering the concrete context of the practice of the language games used for pandemic in a more historical social way than Wittgenstein did, we can evaluate critically the language uses. Thirdly, I would propose a short analysis of language games like we are at war, we fight an invisible enemy, we need a gateway. My idea is that by observing our ways of speaking of the pandemic, we become aware about the necessity to maintain the critical attitude towards our language and the popular thought deposited in it, which Wittgenstein taught us. I will start my talk trying to explain what Wittgenstein means in paragraph 25 of Philosophical Investigations, where he writes that language uses such as, I quote, commanding, questioning, recounting, chatting, are as much a part of our natural history as walking, eating, drinking, end of quote. I will do it by analyzing Wittgenstein's anthropological turn, according to which, in the most important writings after the Tractatus, language was considered by Wittgenstein not more from a logical, formal point of view, but in its relations with the context of use of words. All in the flow of life, language takes form and influences human actions and ways of life. In this regard, in paragraph 491 of Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein writes, quote, not without language we couldn't communicate with one another, but for sure, without language, we cannot influence other people in such and such ways, cannot build roads and machines, etc. And also, without the use of speech and writing, people could not communicate. End of quote. As Wittgenstein argues in Uncertainty, see paragraphs 475, language has practical roots and aims. We need it to communicate, work, collaborate, and in general to act in the society in which we live. I mean to argue that according to Wittgenstein philosophy, which took form after the Tractatus, language is a constitutive part of human social life, and it is as natural for humans as other activities such as walking, eating, drinking. Language is an activity that humans cannot give up, and it is an activity intertwined with the humans' daily ways of living and thinking. I think that the pragmatist view of language arose during Wittgenstein's experience as primary school teacher in the Austrian village. According to which Kinsler reported in his book of 1997, entitled Wittgensteins Wende zu seiner Spätphilosophie, scholars such as Berkeley and Baum underline that the anthropological turn of Wittgenstein's thought finds its roots in his teacher experience. By teaching language to children and by observing the processes of their language learning, Wittgenstein had the opportunity to become aware about the dynamic role of human beings in language creations and in determining the different forms and uses of language. And he could also understand the relationships of dependence between words and actions or praxis of life. It is interesting to remark that these aspects are shown by Wittgenstein's choice of the parameters for drawing up the items of this Wörterbuch für Volksschulen. In this dictionary, he decided to represent the meaning of selected words by giving back to the words the ordinary context of life, reporting examples of common uses of them. Also, the selections of the words to be included in the dictionary responded to the ordinary needs of language use, as well as Wittgenstein imagined they could be for the user of this dictionary. This means words daily used in Austria in the ordinary life of that time, and words that could be useful at work according to the most common jobs and activities of the Austrians, which lived and came from small towns in that time. The idea to create a dictionary for his students and the choice of the parameters for creating it came, as Wittgenstein specified, from the praxis it arose during his experience with the language learning by children and the language teaching to them. In this regard, Wittgenstein wrote, I quote from the Wörterbuch, translating it, "It emerged from the praxis of the author to improve the orthography of his students. It seemed necessary to the author to provide them a dictionary which can put them into the state to learn how to write correctly a word at any time." End of quote. Wittgenstein's dictionary is the first place where Wittgenstein evokes the importance of the praxis in the understanding and the explaining of phenomena. But he didn't focus on the rule of praxis of language, as we will do later. We can say that in the dictionary, he referred to the praxis in a more instinctive way. We will return shortly to the concept of praxis in Wittgenstein's philosophy. So now, the idea on the basis of Wittgenstein's dictionary was to make available to his students an instrument that can teach them the correct orthography, but also a tool that can connect the words with the real life, allowing the students to take part to the form of life of their culture and permitting them to have the lexical basis necessary to create new language uses and to undertake new activities or to get new knowledge. In this regard, I think it's very interesting to know that Wittgenstein used to refer to dialect expressions in order to explain the meaning of new words or to make more understandable what he was explaining to the children. In such cases, when students had difficulties to find the right expression or to understand new German words, he asked, "Wie sagst du zu Hause? How do you say at home?" The dialect was an important part of their form of life, and Wittgenstein didn't reject it, but he used it as a means to connect the familiar context of communication and the ordinary life with the German language learning situations at school, and so with the German official words. The movement is here something like from old meanings to new words. I think that the teaching experience showed to Wittgenstein the inevitable relationship between language and real life, starting from the earliest stages of the development of human beings. That is when a child is trained, educated to use and to understand the language in its different functions within the context of his activities or within the context of the activities of the others which share within the same form of life. In my opinion, also the presence, above all in the Blue Book, of references to the linguistic training of children and to the primitive language games which children use to learn a language should be related to Wittgenstein's experience as primary school teacher. Furthermore, the reference to the game in the development of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language could be influenced by teaching experience. 2. Children learn most of their knowledge, including language skills, by playing and improve their rudimentary forms of game growing up. The new Wittgenstein's way to look at the language in its relations to the real life, starting from the 30s, after his return to Cambridge, and as we can say to the official philosophy, is a phenomenological way, insofar it foresees to look for language uses in order to convert the metaphysical meanings of words into everyday meanings. In this regard, in the well-known paragraph 116 of Philosophical Investigations, we read, I quote, "When philosophers use a word, knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, name, and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used in this way, in the language game, which is its original home? What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use." End of quote. In the first stage of his thought after the return to Cambridge, Wittgenstein was attracted to the construction of a primary phenomenological language to remedy the shortcomings of the theory of language formulating the Tractatus. Although he gave up this project that we find in Philosophical Remarks, he preserved the phenomenological instance, according to which he continued to consider grammar as, I quote from the big TypeScript, the descriptive science of speaking, end of quote, in opposition to the science of thinking, which tries to explain the phenomenon, and he assigned to philosophy the critical task of observing misleading analogies in language uses. Therefore, new Wittgenstein's method to do philosophy is, as Wittgenstein writes in paragraphs 109 of Philosophical Investigations, don't, I quote, advance of any kind of theory, end of quote. Wittgenstein claims that, I quote, we must do away with the whole explanations, and description alone must take its place. And this description gets its light, that is to say its purpose, from the philosophical problems. These are, of course, not empirical problems. They are solved, rather, by looking into the workings of our language, and that in such a way as to make us recognize those workings, in despite of an urge to misunderstand them. The problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, end of quote. In this regard, Wittgenstein used efficaciously the concept of praxis in 1936. In a note published in Eine philosophische Betrachtung, he writes, quote, "An enormous amount of our philosophical problems is created by representing the praxis of our language in a false simplification," end of quote. In 1936, and in particular in Eine philosophische Betrachtung, we find many occurrences of the word praxis. Due this considerable use of the word praxis in the writing of 1936, some scholars, among them Le Piparo, thought that 1936 was the year in which Wittgenstein introduced the concept of praxis into his philosophy. Le Piparo, furthermore, on the basis of this data, claimed a Gramscian derivation via sraffa of the use of praxis in Wittgenstein's philosophy. Actually, by searching the word praxis through the app Witfind, we observe that, putting aside the two occurrences of the word praxis in Wittgenstein's dictionary, which are relevant, but as we said, they could be considered rather instinctive. They are not the result of a real philosophical thinking about the concept of praxis. The word praxis was used by Wittgenstein in 1931, in TS 112, in a passage published in Philosophical Grammar. The passage is the following. This argument is like that between realism and idealism, I'm quoting. In the fact, it has become very soon obsolete, and both parties claim injustice contrary to their daily praxis, end of quote. Wittgenstein refers here to the ordinary praxis to resolve the fight between formalism and substantial mathematics. That is like that between idealism and realism. In that period, Wittgenstein was thinking about mathematics, and he was influenced by the discussion with, on this topic with Ramsay, thanks to which he was developing a pragmatist conception of mathematics. The introduction of the concept of praxis in Wittgenstein's philosophy could be determined by these discussions, and so by Ramsay's ideas. As David lights, from the concept of praxis, Wittgenstein received a way of understanding concepts and ideas based on their collocation in a practical context. This way of understanding seems like that of Sraffa and Gramsci, and it allows us to investigate and clarify important aspects of the concept and ideas. Wittgenstein thinks that philosophy should give back to language the real functions that it has in the ordinary life of people. The understanding of what happens in our private and public life takes form always in a language. We conceptualize the phenomena by language, and so we create a critical linguistic space where it is possible to think and rethink them. New phenomena were structured by old words, which get new meanings, they perform new functions. And this happens because social praxis and the language are characterized by an embeddable actuality. It is a Marxian anthropological way of thinking about language, for which Wittgenstein owns to be indebted to the Italian economist Piero Sraffa, with whom he had engaging in discussions from February 1929 to the year before his death, with up and down and with an abrupt suspensions of 2 years after the 1948. The analogies we can find between Wittgenstein's new method to do philosophy of language and the Marxian way of thinking are the following. The emphasis on circumstances in the formation of meanings. There is no meaning of words, as well as there is no intrinsic value of commodities without a use of both words and commodities in a certain context. The meaning of words as the value of commodities is public. They both, words and commodities, could be not private, meaning of words and value of commodities, could be not private, because they come from a public use by persons in the shared sphere of the society. They are the product of an agreement between human beings. Further, commodities and words could be both affected by fetishism. They both can reflect on the society the values assigned them by the community of people. And then the use of models by the classical economics is present in Wittgenstein's philosophy. Wittgenstein uses language games as model of language from simple to more complex, which can throw light on the various functions of language and on specific aspects of language functions. Nevertheless, from a Marxian point of view, we should remark that in Wittgenstein's thought lacks, as for instance Rossilandi underlines, a real historical social perspective. Therefore, although starting from 30s, Sraffa's criticism influenced Wittgenstein's way of thinking about language, there are important differences between Wittgenstein's philosophy of language and the Marxist philosophy approach. In Wittgenstein's philosophy, we find the public dimension of language, but we don't find the historical social implications of the public character of this dimension. So the language games that Wittgenstein used in his arguments seem detached from the social context. They appear as something already made up, something abstract, something disconnected from the reality, something beyond any dynamic social historical process. Also, the concept of linguistic use seems to be something already made up. It is devoid of production. It is not considered as a result of a linguistic labor. My idea is that these differences depend on the different goals of Wittgenstein's and Marx or Marxian philosophy. Wittgenstein's philosophy is not the aim to change the society through the thought and the thinking of language. It doesn't look at the society. It has the principal goal of changing the philosopher's look by converting it towards the everyday language used at the expense of in despite of the metaphysical ones. If we consider the occurrences of the concept of praxis in the corpus of Wittgenstein's writings, we realize that although Wittgenstein focused on the rule of praxis in the meaning processes of language, he missed to consider these processes within their real historical social context. As Wittgenstein acknowledged in one of the newly discovered letters to Sraffa of 1934, that of 21 February, Wittgenstein perceived that his thought and that of Sraffa had two different movements. Nevertheless, I think that Wittgenstein's philosophy gave us the right method to analyze the concrete language uses. We can use this method in a complementary way to the Marxist conceptual tools for investigating the social historical processes that affect language and the real life with which it is intertwined. Wittgenstein's critical analysis of language allows us to become aware about the connection between language and praxis of life, about the change of meaning which comes from this connection, so the connection between language and praxis of life. And this critical approach, this critical analysis of language alerts us about the possibility that language causes misunderstanding. These Wittgenstein methodological instructions are useful in our thinking and their thinking, the relationship between language and pandemic events, between a pandemic and the change of meanings or of the new meanings of words, such as protected device, war, medications, and etc. Since, according to Wittgenstein, it is impossible to fix once and for all the rules for understanding the changing phenomena in the world and what happens in our life, we can claim that ways of speaking come from the surroundings of experience, and our experiences were thought and conceptualized by language. In this regard, Wittgenstein writes in paragraph 583 of Philosophical Investigations, I quote, "What is happening now has significance in these surroundings. The surroundings give its importance." So things about the sentence, "Smiling mouth smiles all in a human face," end of quote. Therefore, he also affirms in paragraphs 124 of Philosophical Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, I quote, "A word can have meaning only in the praxis of a language," end of quote. In the 40s, the occurrences of the concept of praxis in the corpus of Wittgenstein's writings stresses Wittgenstein's attention on the connection between language and praxis. Starting from this point, from the points of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, which we highlighted, we can ask, in the time of crisis which we are living, what does the relation between social praxis and the language mean? If we don't have fixed rules for understanding new phenomena, like that of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the following crises which hit the world, as we have no fixed rules for using the words in many different contexts. And if we have only this language to talk about the events, to understand them correctly, to influence human behaviors and thought, then we find new meanings for old words, trying to use them appropriately for describing new situations in the ordinary life. In this last part of my talk, I would consider some language games used to talk about the coronavirus crisis. Like that I stated at the beginning, we are in a war, pandemic is a gateway to a better world, we fight an invisible enemy, in order to observe how language uses are woven by social praxis, and how language can positively or negatively influence human action and human thought. My goal is to demonstrate that, as Wittgenstein taught us, we need to maintain, to preserve a critical attitude towards our language and the popular thought which takes form from it and it deposits in it, in the language, in order to avoid misunderstandings of facts. Telling about the pandemic as a war implies that the events were experienced as events of a war, and that the safety measures established by the government were interpreted as special measures in wartime. In many states, pandemic, so think about Italy, Spain, United States, France. So in these states, pandemic was lived and thought according to the conceptual metaphor of the war. Therefore, within the frame, we are at the war. We learn every day through a bulletin the count of victims and survivors, as well as of the injured persons. Doctors and nurses became heroes. They are soldiers lined up in the trenches, called to fight on the front line, to defend ourselves and to defeat the enemy. Some of them decided to go to the front voluntarily, putting their lives at risk. Epidemiologists, virologists, doctors, and scientists assumed the role of strategos of this war. They ordered the moves to face the enemy, to track him down, to predict his moves, and to defend ourselves from his attacks. We also had the front line, where enemy and soldiers faced hard each other. The government ruled the moves. Protective devices became defense arm, while offensive arms which can defeat the enemy were often insufficient or inadequate to fight the invisible force of the enemy. There was an arm race. In the United States, it was not only a metaphor, it happened. We had red areas, which were the areas most occupied by the enemy, and the areas where the struggle was hardest and inhuman. We had daily war predictions, how many killed, how many injured, how many areas will invade by the enemy, will be able to contain the invasion, when will the war end, will we win the battle, will we live with the enemy for a long time, will it retreat forever, or will it return to invade our area? So, what we need to highlight by looking for these language uses, all this talking about the pandemic in terms of a war helped to understand the danger and to accept drastic security safety measures, such as the reduction of freedom, of personal freedom. But we must be aware that any metaphorical conceptualization implies that the two terms of the metaphorical processes, in this case, the health emergencies and the war, are not identical and remain different. So the health emergencies is only partially structured, understood, and defined by the concept of war. Lakoff and Johnson, in their work Metaphors Live By, warn us. Metaphors highlight highlight, and at the same time hide something. In fact, by focusing attention only on certain aspects, a metaphorical concept can stop the focus on other aspects of the same concept, which could be incompatible, dissonant, contrasting with that metaphor. So the war metaphor, used by politicians, scientists, and journalists, frames the situation at the time of the coronavirus from a problematical and emergency point of view. It helps to understand the danger, and therefore it pushes people to chaos, to follow the rules by the expert and to comply them. It prepares to chaos and sudden unexpected changes from a social, economic, and personal point of view. It prepares to suffer and deprivation. It pushes companies to reconvert, as it happens in war economies, to produce indispensable tools in the state of emergency. Things about the such dispositive, the masks, for instance. It performs as a descriptive function, but above all, an emotional and motivational function. To structure the complex scenario in which the coronavirus has put the whole world, we need also complementary and alternative images to that of war. We need perspicuity. We need the perspicuous images that allow us to cross reality by showing different aspects of it. Many have highlighted that it's dangerous. So there is a danger inherent in the possible alteration of the function of the war metaphor. What does happen if its motivational function became merely prescriptive? So what does happen if this metaphor became only prescriptive? Our lives during and after the pandemic, we are totally after the pandemic, we are during the pandemic, take meaning if it take meaning in the form of the word war, what will be the consequences? There is a risk that will get used to accept the restrictions of freedom, deprivation, the sacrifice of human lives. There is the risk that our democracies will become empty, that we become submissive, obedient, and able to build a future. Furthermore, the idea of facing the coronavirus as an enemy implies the risk, as it has already happened, of inducing to face as enemies all those that we believe they are carrying of the virus or potentially carry of the virus. So it involves the risk of putting people against each other. As Susan Serred wrote, I quote, metaphorical wars against disease easily turn into wars for those who embody the disease, end of quote. To tell about the pandemic and the crisis that is caused by the pandemic, we need also, but we use it also, sentences which include the reference to getaway. We say, for instance, we need a way out of this bad situation. So according to the Berkeley Machine Vantage Institute, the getaway metaphor, the metaphor of passage of the access roads and ways out, is the most significant and advantageous metaphor to conceptualize the coronavirus experience. Our concepts need perspicuity to help us to think, live, interpret the complexity of the events and the real life. Our language needs to be thought and rethought in order to avoid conveying pervasive, misleading images, misunderstandings, confusions. So my conclusion is that it is always necessary to find new meanings for old words of our language, collocating them in the real praxis of life. But it is also necessary to preserve Wittgenstein's critical attitude towards our language. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your talk. A lot of stuff in here and a lot to discuss. But before we enter an open discussion, Lucia has prepared a comment, and we will hear this now. For everyone else who wants to ask a question, can already prepare to write their question afterwards, after the comment in the chat, and then we can engage with all these questions. But thank you, Moira, for your talk already. So, Lucia, it's...
You're welcome.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Moira, for a very interesting paper, which shows, in my opinion, how important it is to keep on studying Wittgenstein along these years, because it truly lies at the roots of the pragmatic turn in language. However, some aspects of his philosophy didn't enter the pragmatic turn. I mean, Austin clearly, and all the philosophy of language of Oxford, has clear roots in Wittgenstein's works. At the same time, not recognizing it and not studying it so much, there are some aspects of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language that do not really match with the pragmatics of language. And for example, this critical, exigence to critically review our use of language because of the implication this can have. So it's important to somehow use all the experience from pragmatist stance deriving from Wittgenstein, and also to remember what he specifically said. I thank Moira for many other reasons. One is for the reference to the book of William Bartley about Wittgenstein along this period in studying in rural schools. Bartley's book is one of the, in my opinion, is one of the most beautiful books written on Wittgenstein. Unfortunately, the part devoted to his teaching experience, which really clears and gives an idea of what was the perspective from concrete perspective from which he studied language, was completely overshadowed by polemics that came out because in 3 or 4 pages he talked about Wittgenstein's homosexuality. It was 1973, this caused an enormous reaction, and so Bartley's book is linked in scholars' memory, I mean, not in on the wide side, is remembered as the book that cleared out Wittgenstein homosexuality, while in fact is an extremely important book. Thanks, Moira, for referring it to. It's not really known, but every Wittgenstein scholar, in my opinion, should read it. Then another remark I have. So if I got what you said, I mean, we know that it is like this. You say that Wittgenstein in the second part of the, let's call it the second part, however it is a tricky matter if it is a second part or just an progressive path from the Tractatus to the philosophical investigations. However, in the second part of his speculation, Wittgenstein held language and social praxis necessarily twinned. And then language as a social game. But, in fact, an interesting thing that should be even more examined, as you do, by the way, is how this idea of social is abstract. I mean, he says you cannot even approach language without considering it that it is a social practice, but somehow it is a synchronic view, a snapshot of what we are doing. It's not interesting in how we arrived to this particular form of game. and especially is not interested in the social consequences for a game. And this is a trait that, in my opinion, we can still find in the philosophy of Oxford, Austin, Grice, etc., etc. I mean, it was somehow apart from social involvement. Anyway, and another very interesting hint is to Wittgenstein's attention to dialects at the time of his teaching in the rural schools, because this gives a perfect chain in order to compare Gramsci's views on language and Wittgenstein's views on language. And this could help scholars to better understand whether and if and how there could be influences from Gramsci on Wittgenstein, because Gramsci had a peculiar position about dialects. He studied language, and there are beautiful pages of Gramsci devoted to the necessity of keeping dialects in order to keep people rooted in what there was their history and social context, which is important. I don't know if I have still some time. May I go on? Just because a remark. When you say the references to children games could come as well from his teaching experience, I would give also another hint to this. I'm convinced that the references to children games in the Blue Book, that start in the Blue Book, are consequent to his attention having been drawn to Augustine's idea of how children are taught language by Raffaello Piccoli. So the idea why he was, and he read and he started talking about Augustine's view of how children learn language in 1931, 1932, 1933. But then, you're right, he took the idea to discuss it, the idea of Augustine of how children do learn language, and in his mind, the comparison was with his experience. It was his experience that put, in my opinion, and in my opinion, because I agree with you, and I agree with Bartley, that the concrete experience that shaped then his way of discussing language through the observation of linguistic games and how children learn language came from his experience as a teacher. And then I come finally to the second part of your talk about war metaphors for discussing COVID. I totally agree with you that we should keep this critical way of considering language and reflect on how language shapes the world, how words shapes language, and stuff. It is an interesting debate, the debate about, especially from people working on metaphor. We are using a lot of war metaphors. Governments are using war metaphors. War metaphors proved very effective to push people run in the same direction, as, by the way, Wittgenstein said, Sraffa told me once, talking about a strike. So war metaphor pushes people doing quickly and without questioning many things that can be worth when there's an enemy. But the problem is we should completely change the idea. Someone, for example, suggested that the first thing, we should not see the COVID as an enemy, but we should talk about it, not him. You see, the enemy personifies the thing. We should consider the virus as a problem in a more evolutionary path, as an opportunity. This would be a Buddhist frame. However, COVID is not an enemy, but is a problem. Another very interesting metaphor, alternative metaphor I read in those days is, someone said, we should not talk as we are in war. We are not at war. We are in care. Or we are taking care. We are under treatment. In order to change the deep conceptual scheme that governments for many valuable reasons, for perhaps at the beginning, not surely now, they are still instilling in us. So we changing the meaning of the words, and think about how it's interesting the idea of changing the meaning of our old words or old concepts. Imagine how, and this, in my opinion, links with the presentation David made in July about how changed, about the idea that showing our face is something that belongs to our mentality, okay? Let's say Western mentality. And how do you think how the meaning of an object like protective devices, masks, can change, from the Gestalt point of view as well, our perception of what it is to have our face covered when we face cultural diversity. Masking our face has been always described as something that violates our rights as citizens, as Western citizens, and somehow, as a metaphor, hided many things. For example, protection, that it means now, it is really emphasized, and this on the long run will certainly change the perception people have towards people wearing veils or other stuffs. And it's interesting to see, and another thing would be, let's build also new words for old meanings. Let's recuperate good meanings and flow it in new words. I hope I was clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Moira, would you like to answer to some of the points Lucia raised directly?
Yes, of course. So thank you very much, Lucia, for your suggestions and for your questions. So some aspects of Wittgenstein's philosophy didn't fit the pragmatist turn. So right, yeah, I think that so I don't know if we can say that they didn't fit the pragmatist turn, but I think that from the Marxian point of view, the Marxian's perspective, it lacks in Wittgenstein's philosophy this historical social theory. But I think that this is not a real problem, because my idea is that Wittgenstein provides us the method. So he draws the way to get the implication of this critical work, critical analysis of language, also by an historical social point of view. No, my talk is an attempt in this direction. No, use Wittgenstein's philosophy in order to better understand, to clarify our ways of speaking about an important, critical phenomena as this phenomena of the pandemic of coronavirus. No, I think is a good example of this use of Wittgenstein's methodology, Wittgenstein critical methodology, to approach language, to analyze language, to look for language in order to clarify the phenomenon and the conceptualization of the phenomenon, the inevitable linguistic conceptualization of what happened in the world, what happens in the world. Right, Wittgenstein lacked this real social spice. I think that it's visible that in Wittgenstein's philosophy lacks this real social perspective, real social space in the use of language models. He didn't take concrete, real daily language games. No, he creates, he abstract these models, and I think that Sraffa was critical, no, on this way of thinking. So when Wittgenstein said, okay, the movement of my thought is different of the movement of your thought, no, say. Told to Sraffa. So I think that one of the most problem during their discussions what this Sraffa attempted to be in the concrete situation, attempted to take Wittgenstein in the concrete real situations of life, no? And Wittgenstein, maybe because of this goal to take the philosopher in the ordinary life, but the ordinary life, not the concrete real life, but the ordinary language. So the goal is to purify the language. And to remove the metaphysical use of language. So just this was his goal, and not he had not the goal to transform, to make a change in the society, like the goal of the Marxian perspective. You know, Marxian analysis have the goal to change the society, to transform the society. Another point. Sorry, another point, another interesting point is that of dialect. So for me, it's a very important point, a very important question. Thank you, Lucia. So it's very interesting that dialect was also so important in Gramsci's philosophy. Wittgenstein used dialect in a period before this hypothesis of Gramsci's influence, Gramsci's influence via Sraffa on Wittgenstein's thought. But I think it's very important because this refer to the dialect refers to something familiar, something concrete, real, so a concrete, real part of the form of life of speakers. So it's very interesting that he had already used this referment in the time of the dictionary. So it's one of the reasons because I consider it very important, this experience of a primary teacher, of his primary teacher experience, because I think that maybe then this experience helped Wittgenstein to see, to better understand this connection between language and praxis of life. So many thanks for the suggestions about children language games, so primitive language games of children to learn a language. So I think, yeah, I think that the language, the primary teacher experience was important, but not only the important refers to the important point of influence of this use of children language games. Yeah, thank you very much for the reference to Piccoli. I think that Augustine's quotation was the most was the central point of this use of children language games, but the rule of game was undoubtedly important for children, no? For children's knowledge, for the acquirement of knowledge by children. So last 2 points, personification of virus, so important point, is part of the metaphorization work, metaphorization operation. No? It's very important because we are at war implies that the enemy was someone, was not something, not a problem, as you suggested, but is like a person, no? Is a personification. So, and when we became aware about this wrong or misleading personification, we can find, as you did, other alternative images, no? Alternative meaning for our whole words. Alternative meanings that could help us to better to grasp, to better understand the complexity of this situation. So my idea is that we need, as Wittgenstein taught us, a perspicuity, so perspicuous images, not only an image, but many different images, many different functions, many different new meanings for our whole words. So last point, the masks. Yes, I think that there is a gestaltic change of cultural meaning. No, it's very important, this point, because there is a change of meaning, because masks before the pandemic was a tool used only by doctors, no, or only in medical structures, and then it became something ordinary for all of us. So it's and assume and acquired another a new meaning, because the meaning is protect, defend ourselves from the virus, but also from the others that could be carrier of the virus. So that's an important point, because change also the meaning of the others in our relationships with them in the society, because we need distances, we need to protect ourselves from the others, and etc. So I think that there are all important points to think in order to better understand. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Moira.
Okay, so thank you both for your input, and now the floor is open for